Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we delve into the vibrant life of the North Fork of Long Island. Here we engage with the pressing issues, explore the myriad opportunities, and recount the fascinating stories that shape our community's past and present. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 61, our guest today is Rena Wilhelm. She's the owner of the Weathered Barn in Greenport and the president of the Greenport Skate Park. She shares stories of her ancestry, childhood, as well as her career in interior design, including her time at Ethan Allen. Rena's commitment to community shines through her leadership as president of the Greenport Skate Park, where she not only advocates for enhancements, but also spearheads fundraising efforts to build a newer and safer skate park for the community. She also talks about what she hopes for the future for Greenport and the future of the North Fork community. So I hope you enjoy episode 61 with Rena Wilhelm. This episode was recorded May 31st, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you very much. I am too.
And to start off, can you give us a brief introduction where you were born and raised?
Yes. I was born in Yonkers Hospital, and I was raised in Mount Vernon, New York, which is a lower part of Westchester County, and stayed in lower Westchester, I would say, through till I was like age 30, and then ended up moving up to Ossining, New York, which is on the Hudson, a little bit northern Westchester County, before moving out here in 2011. So my whole life is Westchester County, and unlike you, I haven't really traveled anywhere.
And then going back now in terms of ancestry, how far back can you go on your parents?
So
your parents?
When I was born, the only grandparent that was alive was my mother's mother, and she lived with us. I grew up in a two-family home, and so she was the only living elder relative. But I do have a little bit of history on my dad's side, which is actually quite interesting, and my grandmother's side too. My grandparents on my mother's side are from Italy. And my father's side, his father was born in Montreal by way of Ireland. And his, my grandfather's parents, Ireland and France. So my immediate grandfather on my father's side was born in Montreal and ended up in the Park Hill section of Yonkers, which at the time, and probably still is a pretty beautiful area of Yonkers. So I can tell you a little bit about my grandfather.
Sure. And that's your grandfather on
my father's side.
Father's side.
Yeah. So my last name is Casey, before marriage. And so my grandfather was Frank Casey, and he worked for New York Pneumatic Company in Manhattan, and that they were he was an engineer, and they did things like I don't really know anything about engineering, but a lot of it had to do with like timing of like brake pedals for like buses. But early on, that company, I remember, this is my only living relative on my father's side is my Uncle Bob, and he had told me that my grandfather, Frank, was responsible for helping design the timer for the pneumatic timer for when bullets were shooting out of like warplanes, so that they weren't hitting the blades of the airplane. So that's that's what his background was in pneumatics. So that company, New York Pneumatic, and then he ended up starting his own company called Casey Pneumatic, doing similar engineer type work. And my father, growing up, he grew up in Yonkers. Oh, so my grandfather Frank was he was the vice president of New York Pneumatic, and then he also was the first president and helped create the Park Hill Racket Club. So he was a pretty well-known figure in the whole Park Hill section of Yonkers, and all the Caseys lived there. And then my mother's side, my mom was born, I think my mom was either born in the Bronx or Lower Westchester, like Mount Vernon, Eastchester area. And her parents, I'm named after my grandmother on my mother's side, Irena, and her father, Dominic. They came from like the Naples area of Italy. My grandfather was from Avellino, and I believe my grandmother was from Salerno. And then they ended up emigrating to New York and living in the Bronx before moving to Mount Vernon. And they owned a grocery store in Mount Vernon, Italian grocery store. And it's interesting because my uncle on my mother's side still has pieces, like an old butcher block from the grocery store. He still has, it's framed like the price list of the groceries where like peas were like 3 cents for a can. He even has the old iron weight set, because that's how things were, they didn't have scales. So this was like the iron scale. And so he's got things like that. He's got ice cream parlor chairs from the grocery store also. And then sadly, my grandfather on my mother's side had passed away maybe like a year before I was born, so I never met him. And my grandmother, after my grandfather passed away, my grandmother, my family ended up getting a 2-family house, and then my mother moved in with my grandmother. So I was lucky that my grandmother actually lived upstairs from me my whole childhood, and she had a very big influence on me. She was pretty extraordinary. Yeah. And
now, in terms of your dad's side, what did he do for work?
So my father went to a lot of boarding schools and then ended up going to Notre Dame. And he also was a Marine, not a combat Marine, but he spent time in the Marines, I think Fort Bragg or something like that. But I think he left college. He went to Notre Dame to play football for them, and then left college to work with my grandfather for Casey Pneumatic. And then my father, after Frank, my grandfather, passed away, my father sort of spawned his own company off of that, and it was Casey Equipment Corp. And my dad was, I would say, he was an architectural engineer. And he had an office in our house, like in the basement. And later on, I ended up studying interior design and architecture, and was able to piece together all the things that I saw in my dad's office, like architectural rulers and the drafting table. So my dad actually specialized in designing brushless car washes. So when you think of like the conveyor belt and the timing and how one brush comes down and how the air comes out and how the hoses come on, like all of that. So that's, again, in that sort of pneumatic engineering kind of background, very specialized. And then he also, not only did he design them, but he sold the equipment, and he also did the servicing. He did a lot. And it was just him. And then actually my brother ended up working with him for a little bit. But it's interesting because I never really understood or appreciated what it's like to own your own business and have cash flow issues. So when you do a job for a client, you have to do all this work ahead of time, right? When you're designing something to pitch it to, who you're selling it to. And then they have to buy into it. And then until the job is sort of completed, do you get the balance due of the job. So unless you've got multiple jobs like lined up where they're all sort of completing at the same time, there's a big lag in like cash flow. So I think that was a little bit difficult for my family in terms of growing up, whereas my mom was she was an executive secretary for an insurance company for a very, very long time. So it was her job actually that maintained everything in my life. She had a very steady job. She was an extremely hard worker. She still works. She's 85. So it was her work that sort of allowed me things like private school and extracurricular activities. And although my father had a very big influence on me as far as like how my brain works and what I ended up doing for a living, sports and all that other kind of stuff, I got all that from my dad, but it was a little rough.
Mm. And how did your parents meet?
My parents, I think they were introduced to each other. And I don't know when. I mean, my father has since passed. He passed in like 1996. I think they were just introduced to each other. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting. My mother's family was very traditional Italian. And his family was a bunch of partiers. They were Irish and had country club issue, like that kind of atmosphere, which was completely different than my mother's upbringing, which was much more strict. Mm-hmm. But my dad, as far as his influence on what he did for a living, I think I was naturally born with the ability to draw very technically also. And so the kinds of things that I did, like I never played with Barbies, like that just wasn't, first of all, I was a total tomboy. I still am. But I played, like my favorite toy was like the erector set. I loved tools. I loved screwdrivers, bolts, nuts, building things. That just came naturally to me. I'm very mechanically inclined. And I think that's just natural. So it was nice that my father was that way, because it just sort of like brought that out of me, of like what kind of traits I have. And then my mother's side, my grandmother, again, she lived with us upstairs. I basically grew up in her sewing room. So she was great. She taught me how to sew. So I had that ability. So building from my dad, sewing from my grandmother. My theatrics come from my mother. But my grandmother also was very ingenious. She was always like rigging things mechanically. We had like the old like clothes line on the pulley. Yeah. She fastened it. So on the back of our house, two-family, there was a porch out on the upper level and a porch on the lower level. And she took that pulley from the clothesline and put it vertically on a post. And then and then if my brother and I were playing in the background, she would pulley down like snacks and stuff. So she was just ingenious, very inventive.
Is that something that you think came from that old world?
I'm sure.
Back in Italy,
I'm sure.
And just kind of using different things to make do with.
I wouldn't doubt it. She was one of, I think, maybe 6 or 7 children. Some were who were in America and some were who were still in Italy. And I'm not even sure where she was in the lineage. I think she was somewhere in the middle of the siblings. But again, I have like memories of her and my life with her, but not as much of like the information of her life. That would probably take me like a long time to sort of dig into that. My mother has all that info. But yeah. And
when you were a child, did they still have that grocery store at the time, or?
No. So my grandfather passed away, and then my grandmother was just the widow. Back in the Italian heritage, then she would have worn black for the rest of her life, and I think she probably wore black for like a little bit of time, but then that. So my grandmother was just home, which also allowed my mother to work full time, and my grandmother sort of like took care of me when I wasn't in school. But because my mom did work full time, I ended up doing nursery school and kindergarten in the same day. So I ended up being, and I'm also born in December, so I was one of the youngest people in my class because I did both. So in the morning, my mom would drop me off at nursery school, and then on her lunch break, she would pick me up from nursery school and drop me off at kindergarten. And when she got off of work, I was out of kindergarten. So that was a very full day of school at age, I don't know, 4 or 5. I have no idea.
And I know you mentioned a little bit about some of the activities you might do as a child in the area, but could you say any other things that come to mind that you did, whether it was through elementary, middle school?
So in elementary school, I was always an artist. Like the second I could pick up a crayon, I was drawing. I was constantly drawing. My dad was really supported that a lot. He always set up like a drawing table like outside his office. I told you it was like in the basement. So the basement was a finished basement. It was really, really large. So I had a whole section of the basement that was he outfitted with crayons and colored pencils and paper and scissors. And so I was constantly creating stuff. And I was also a little bit of a loner. I wasn't someone who... I was very happy being by myself, I think because I could just entertain myself. But I was also very athletic and played probably every sport there was. So my engagement with friends typically came through like sports, school and sports. And then I continued sports in high school. In high school, I went to a private Catholic girls' school, Ursuline Academy in New Rochelle, which is part of Westchester. An amazing school. Still have very good friends from there. I was very rebellious, very artsy, alternative music. We had to wear a Catholic school uniform, but if we didn't have uniforms, I would have been like the goth kid. But I was also a total jock. So I was a gymnast. I played field hockey. Basketball, I think the only reason I made the basketball team at all was because I was extremely fast and I wasn't a good player. I could just get down to the other side of the court faster than anyone else could. And track. My best sport was sprints, besides field hockey, because that was running. The entire game for an hour was just running back and forth on a field. But track I did from grammar school through high school.
And what about in terms of subject or course subjects? Were you interested in any specific areas?
Art, definitely.
Art, yes.
Also, my brain was, I'm very mechanically inclined and musically inclined. And my brain learns things. I'm a visual learner. And so literary and reading, I didn't even really understand that I was a very good student. I mean, I was sort of like a B plus student. And the only reason I wasn't an A student is because I was awful at history and reading because I never read the books because I didn't remember anything. And honestly, not until like I got into college did I understand that, whoa, like I have a severe reading comprehension problem. And interestingly enough, and I went to very good schools, no one ever really picked up on it. And I think because of that visual memory that I have, like if I write something down in a notebook, it's memorized like almost instantly. So if you had like a multiple choice test, I would also, I would visualize it in my notebook. I don't even know if I understood what the subject really was, but I knew what the keywords were. So I think that's really the only way I got through those, like history and English. Math, I was a total whiz. But art was sort of like my focus. And I was lucky enough that my high school had amazing classes for the arts. And now they have an entire building just for the arts in my high school. My high school, I barely even recognize it. It's so like high tech now. But
renovated and upgraded.
Yeah. It's a beautiful school. So yeah, I definitely leaned and still lean everything creative. I'm a visual learner. And you don't really find people who are creative who are also technical. So that combination, and that's where you find like architectural engineers, and which I get from my father, but that's how my brain works anyway, which is rare. So in my creativity, even though I'm kind of visually all over the place, it always comes back down to like a very technical, the way puzzles, the way things fit together. That's just how my brain works.
And you mentioned that it was a Catholic school. Now, in terms of the teaching, was it mostly nuns, or was it
half nuns, half just non-nuns? My principal was a nun. The vice principal was a nun. It certainly wasn't, this was in the 80s, so it wasn't back, say, like in the 50s and 60s, where like you were getting, a ruler slapped on your knuckles or a paddle. It wasn't like that at all, but it was good. It was really good. And not a lot of male teachers. I think there was like one male science teacher and one male history teacher, but otherwise it was all female.
Yes.
And so the brother school was Iona. There was Iona Grammar, Iona Prep. When I started Ursuline, it was 7th through 12th grade. So I started there in 12th grade. I started there in 7th grade. I think now they've actually lowered it to like 6th grade. But, and I also went to, my grammar school was Chapel School in Bronxville, which was like a Lutheran school, and I was raised Catholic. So there was a whole bunch of us who were Catholic, who were not Lutheran, who had to be bussed over to the Catholic church for what they called CCD. I don't even know what that stands for. Catholic something.
Yeah.
So Catholic education, some kind of thing like that. So, yeah.
And then now, coming out of high school, did you know what you wanted to do?
So it was interesting. I had a scholarship to go to SUNY Purchase, and didn't take it because I didn't want to go to an art school, which was really weird. Like, you would think that would be like my natural sort of plight, but I didn't want to be boxed in by just art. And I think, as supportive as my high school was of the arts, there was this underlying, and I think, again, this is the 80s, there was this underlying idea that you couldn't make any money being an artist, so you should go into more academic, tough-focused careers, not art. Yeah. So I was almost afraid that I was going to be limiting myself if I went to an art school, and I ended up going to Cortland University for a semester. And that was a wild ride that did not end well. For someone who was raised in a strict home and went to a Catholic school, I was out of control there, and did not last long up there, and then ended up coming back, and I ended up going to Iona College, which is now Iona University, but that was also in New Rochelle. And I ended up taking advertising because they didn't have like an arts program, so to speak. They had art classes. So I majored in advertising, which was probably the most creative avenue you could take, where you were still considered you could get a career sort of in advertising. And then I just minored in art. All my like sort of elective classes were art classes. And then I was looking for a job out of college, and I ended up getting a job with Lancome, which was a makeup company. But I was like a makeup artist, skincare consultant in a department store part-time. I did that for 6 months until I was able to get a job in an advertising firm in the city as their receptionist. So again, with that sort of rebellious nature that I had, I was like, I'm not going to be a receptionist, cocky sort of 21, 22-year-old where I just wanted to be in the back where everyone was doing like the creative stuff. But they needed a receptionist. I got the job as a receptionist, and the only way I would have been able to move into the creative section was if I paid my dues and spent 2 years being a receptionist. And that was not okay in my book. And it was also, to be honest, a very male-dominated, misogynistic atmosphere, and I ended up leaving. It was actually pretty outrageous that if any of those things that were said to me back then were said now, like there would be like a lawsuit.
Yes.
So that was the early 90s. Yeah, it was awful.
Mm,
and then I left, and then I ended up waitressing for a while. And then, throughout high school and college, I always had a job. I worked for like clothing stores. I always worked in like retail. I think my like first job was like worked in a supermarket like most people do when they're like 15 years old. So after I waitressed, I had moved out. I was living with a bunch of college friends. I ended up getting a job as a manager for Claire's boutique, which at the time it wasn't as much of a teeny bopper type of store as it was when I worked for them. But I ended up being one of their senior merchandisers. They gave me, when they opened stores in Manhattan, they gave me the first Manhattan store. And then subsequently I went around throughout the district setting up other stores. So that visual merchandising became like a huge focus for me. And that was probably the best part of that job. Managing those stores were doing the visual merchandising. Typically, most retail stores have like a corporate store, and they give you what they call like a planogram. And they have one main store at headquarters, and all the stores are supposed to look exactly like that. Well, whoever designed the store in headquarters, it was awful. So I was lucky that my district manager recognized that, and we all sort of ended up tailoring our stores to look just a certain way. And our district always just looked the best. I need things to be very symmetrical and very organized, and so there comes that analytical thing, right? And I was like militant about everything being in order, but I wasn't going to do that for the rest of my life. I felt like there was something else that I needed to do, and I ended up going to the New York School for Interior Design. And when I went to that school, one of my first classes was drafting, and there I was sitting at a drafting table with an architectural, everything now is done on the computer, but this was all like mechanically by hand drafting. And I was like, oh my God, these are all the things I played with in my father's office. So like not until I was like 26 did I start making a connection of like what my dad really did for a living.
Yes.
Yeah. So that, talk about coming full circle, like yourself, like it just it kind of evolved, and I'm like, okay, this is what the things I played with as a kid, and this is how my brain works, and this is actually what I'm doing. And then practiced interior design. I worked for Ethan Allen in Hartsdale, which is in Westchester, for 5 years before leaving and starting my own practice for I think 6. I did it for 6 years. And that's where I ended up learning that issue about cash flow, the same kind of issue my father had, owning your own business, where if I had a client and I was designing their living room, I had to draft the entire living room, pull all the paint colors, and whip up this beautiful presentation, and then present it and hope that they bought into it. So in the meantime, how am I getting paid for all that work that I just did? You maybe would take like a retainer and say, okay, well, I'll take this as a retainer, and then once you go through with the job, then that retainer will apply to the deposit. And typically the deposit only paid for what they were buying, and not until the furniture and everything was installed did they have to pay the balance, and that's when I got paid. So unless I had, which thankfully I did, tons of clients whose projects were all coming through at the same time, I was able to have that sort of more steady flow of cash. But what ended up happening is that I didn't have a 401k anymore. I didn't, like I did when I was with Ethan Allen, I didn't have health benefits anymore. My husband is diabetic, and so health insurance was extremely important. And he had worked for someone who he didn't have health insurance through that. So I had realized that it was more of a struggle than I wanted, and ended up going back to Ethan Allen, but in Stamford, Connecticut, as their window treatment manager. Worked with all the designers on the floor, helping them design window treatments for their clients. And subsequently, I still had clients from my own practice who sort of followed me there. They kind of followed me wherever I was. there were some people who like couldn't buy bathroom towels without me saying like, don't choose these, you should choose those. And it was great. I mean, I had such great relationships with these clients. But I was hired in 2008 and then the market crashed. So I lasted for, I think like 6 to 8 months. And then my entire position was wiped out. Everybody was getting wiped out. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I had my own business. I thought I was going back and doing the right thing by working for a corporation, you know, and having all those benefits and the 401k and all these things. And now I don't have it anymore. So I was really stuck. I was like, I don't even know what I'm going to do. I still had design clients. I was like, I guess I could still do some jobs on the side. And then I had Cobra, and that was, you know, I think you only get that for like 18 months. So went back to doing like design work. And then as that started running out, the Cobra started running out, I went into like a little bit of a panic. And then I could tell you how I evolved into what I do now.
Sure.
If we're on that path.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to ask was with your time in Manhattan, if you could just describe a little bit about, more so not with your work, but just the environment.
I hated it.
You hated it.
I hated it. You know,
some people, that's kind of like they have this all in their mind, how they think it will be when they go into the city. And
I think coming out of whether it's high school or college, there is this sort of assumption that like, oh, well, you have to get a job in Manhattan. If you're from this area, certainly, you know, you have to get a job in Manhattan because then that means, you know, that's what everybody did. And to be honest, it's, I could care less if I ever go into the city again. So I worked in the city for 5 or 6 years. And the whole, I didn't go to the city to enjoy the sights. I was going there for work, right? So it was getting on a train, you know, at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, then getting on a subway, you know, to get to my job, then walking blocks, and then getting there in this, again, sort of corporate atmosphere. And anytime I was walking, like if you don't walk like 70 miles an hour, you will just literally get run over. So I always say if you work in Manhattan, it's very similar to rats being in a cage. It's just tons of people. There's just way too many people, and no one is engaging with each other, right? They all have their heads down. And this is different now because no one even had cell phones back then, but it might
be even worse now.
It's probably worse now because people aren't even watching where they're going. But it was an aggressive atmosphere that I don't appreciate. And I'm glad I did it and glad I have that experience, but I'll never do that again. And quite frankly, I don't think I would ever work for, and I don't have to, thank God, but I don't think I would ever go back to a corporate atmosphere.
Yes.
Again, either. I think also once you own your own business, going to work for someone else is very difficult because in your mind, you have the way things should run based on your own experience. And then you go to somewhere else and they want it run this way. And it's almost like having to check your ego a little bit and say like, okay, anything that I know to be common sense goes out the window because this person wants it done this way. And maybe their way is common sense too, but nevertheless, I'm lucky that I do what I do and I'm not faced with that anymore. So yes, back to your original question. What was the city like? I hated it. And it was one of those things where it just was so cyclical, just routine. It's almost like Groundhog Day, if you know that movie with Bill Murray. Like the alarm goes off and you get up and in the shower, on the train, down in the city, at my desk, back on the train, and during all that is when I decided to go back to school. So, and this is such a blur. I don't even know how I got through it, but I was managing the store in the city. And then so the store opened at 8 o'clock in the morning. I worked till 4, and I started taking night classes at the New York School for Interior Design, which was So I worked on 42nd Street, and that was up on 70th Street. So that was another subway up to go to school at night. I wasn't getting out until like 9 because they were studio classes. So they were at least like 3 hours long. And then subbing it back to Grand Central, then training it back up. It was a lot. So yes, right after college, worked in the city in the advertising, then got out of that, went back to the city for do the visual merchandising and working for Claire's, and then going to school at night. So I spent a fair enough time in the city, but none of it was for, hanging out and socializing or going to theaters or going to plays and that kind of thing. It was just always work or school related.
Yes. No, and then now, after 2008, with the crash and then having the layoff. Mm-hmm. So what were you thinking now that you said you possibly could do some freelance work?
Yeah, design work. But in a strange sort of turn of events, where I was living, my husband and I was living in Yonkers when I met my husband. He moved up, he's originally from Syosset area. He moved up to Westchester with me when we got married, and then we ended up moving up to Ossining. And where we lived in Ossining was called Ossining Campgrounds, and it was the oldest Swedish Methodist campground in the United States. And what that was a Bible study campground where people came up from the city, and the houses were almost like tents. They eventually evolved into like these gingerbread cottages. There's two other, Oaks Bluff and Martha's Vineyard was a Swedish Methodist campground. And then there's Ocean Grove, pardon me, in New Jersey. Mm-hmm. That was also a Swedish Methodist campground. So Ossining, I think it was like 7 acres, and there were 40 tiny little gingerbread cottages. They're really charming, and it was private community, and it had a lot of the original buildings from those days. It had a beautiful auditorium. It had this gorgeous tabernacle and what was at the time, I guess, like a cafeteria. Very large white buildings with chippy peeling paint that I absolutely adored. And I decided, but they were falling apart. And I remember saying this auditorium that we had, it had no heat, no insulation, but open rafters. It was a gorgeous building. The roof needed to be repaired. And it was so affordable living there. So when you lived there, you leased the land and you owned your house. So you had to pay dues to the homeowners association, right? The homeowners association never wanted to raise money because this was supposed to be a very affordable place to live, but then everything was falling apart. So when I moved there, they started raising the rental fees, but they still weren't fixing anything. So I was like, you know what, this is a beautiful building, and why don't we use it for something? So I'm going to backtrack a little bit. When we moved there, part of the conditions of living there and the taxes being so low were that there were 4 Bible sermons, masses, right, on Sundays. Mm-hmm. And they needed to do those so that they could still be a tax exempt organization. So it was suggested, not required, that we went to these masses. And the first one I went to was outrageous. It was I don't know if he was a minister. I'm not religious. I don't practice anything now, but I don't know what kind of denomination or faith he was, but everything was like fire and brimstone, and we were all going to hell. Repentance. I thought I was in the Twilight Zone. And then I just remember looking at Jason and I had to bow my head because I was almost laughing. And I'm like, this is something out of a freak movie. At any rate, so that became less and less we were there for 10 years. So as the homeowners association changed sort of board members, it wasn't, I think we still had the tax exemption, but I think we had like one sort of mass, which was more of like we used to have like potluck dinners and more community oriented kind of things, less sort of formal religious kind of things there. So when we started those potlucks or whatever, and I was like, why don't we have, we need to raise money. Why don't we have a some kind of holiday boutique in the auditorium? And I tend to be like this. This is the kind of person I am, where I'll just whip an idea out of nowhere and then just execute it as if I know what I'm doing, but I really don't. And then it ends up just being successful.
Yeah.
So I'm still like that. So I organized this holiday boutique, and I recruited a whole mess of artisans. The auditorium was 40 feet wide and 60 feet long. It was gigantic. And so we filled it with at least 40 artisans. Also, the property that I was on was private. No one, unless you lived there, you couldn't walk on the grounds. And so it was always a little bit of a mystery to the other residents of Ossining. What is this? Why is it a campground? No one really understood the history of it. So we opened it up to the public. And for the first time, people who lived in Ossining were able to kind of tour like this little tiny mini Victorian campground place. The first time they had ever stepped into the auditorium. We had coffee, we had cakes, it was decorated. It was the first of its kind. I think they still run it, actually. I moved here in 2011. I think they host it still. But so in that, I'm going to get to the point somewhere. In that, my panic of what am I going to do with my life? I just got laid off and I have some design jobs. My friend who was an artisan there, I was talking with her and I'm like, I don't even know, what am I going to do? I have no idea what I'm going to do with my life right now. Mm-hmm. She's like, you know what? She was like, you ran that boutique amazingly. She's like, you were in your element. Mm-hmm. And she's like, and you looked so happy. She's like, why don't you go back to so when I had my interior design practice, it was like a half retail boutique, half interior design. She's like, I think you should go back to having a retail boutique. And she was like, and maybe get some artisans mm-hmm. to participate with you, to contribute, like, say, to the rent. And there were, in Mount Kisco, which is a village that was close to Ossining, there were these things, these sort of co-ops, these creative co-ops where the rent was X. You had 10 artisans in that. They were all responsible for paying towards the rent. And if you worked at the store, then you got a discount on your rent or something like that. So I knew those kinds of things existed. So my friend was like, why don't you do that? And this was Westchester, and it was like the rents were like insane. So she's like, why don't you just put it out there in the universe? She's like, you're going to spend $300 a month. And I'm like, okay, $300 a month. And then I'm like, all right. And one day I'm just looking on Craigslist. I don't even know if people even use that anymore. And right there in for rent was 400 square feet, $300 a month rent, art studio in a place called Sugarloaf, New York. And I was like, okay. I was like, this is the universe telling me, you know what I mean? Like, what were the chances that I was going to find something for $300? But I had never even heard of Sugarloaf. I had no idea what it was. Sugarloaf was and is this historical hamlet of Warwick Valley. Now, this was about 45 minutes away from where I was living in Westchester, over the Bear Mountain Bridge. And it was an artisan hamlet. They had potters, a leather tanner, the local herbalist, a soap maker, candle maker, like all your basics were there in this cute village where the houses were stores. So they renovated the fronts of their homes for retail boutiques and lived in them. Mm. So anyway, so that's where I ended up in 2010. But when I went there for the first time to visit, I'm like, wow, I was like, there is nobody here. There is nobody here. Warwick was about like a mile and a half away, and that was like a bustling village, great mm-hmm. restaurants, great shops, but I needed my $300 a month rent. Mm-hmm. So I was like, all right, I have nothing to lose. At the time, my husband was working for a furniture maker furniture designer and restoration guy. So we had a little bit of a solid sort of foundation. So I took this risk and opened up a shop in Sugarloaf. And as a newcomer with all these ideas, they were like, "Can you run our website? Can you organize this?" That's just, I came with that kind of energy where I was like, let's make some things happen, right?
Yeah.
And despite that effort, it was after 2008, people weren't coming up to Sugarloaf as a destination to buy handmade goods because, quite frankly, they were expensive. And what ended up happening, and again, I got there in 2010, so for 2 years after that economy crashed, the business owners started bringing in cheaper items, imports, and now you've just devalued the destination of going in and seeing these artists in residence, stores, creators, makers. If you could get the same thing traveling an hour and a half from the city that you could get, on the street at a flea market, then what's the point of traveling to this destination? So I sort of saw the writing on the wall a little bit. And also what started happening was that these store owners, because there was less and less traffic, if their hours were, okay, our store is open from 11 to 6, well, I haven't had a sale in 3 hours, so it's 3 o'clock, I'm going to close. So now the people that were coming to visit were pulling on doorknobs and they were locked. And then it was a crapshoot, basically. So I always stayed there. I said I was open. I'll be here. I would drive there 45 minutes. If there was a blizzard, I would still go there. And made amazing connections, made amazing friends. I'm still friends with a lot of people up there. But we signed a 1-year lease. And when the lease was up, this was in April of 2011, I said I could either dig my heels in and try to make a go of it up there, or I could relocate. And at the same time this was happening, my Cobra ran out from being laid off from Ethan Allen. Again, Jason's job was steady, but it wasn't a lot. And without the health insurance, the medical expenses were, for someone with diabetes, and this is a whole nother saga, but my husband was going blind from diabetes right when we got married. So we just went through a lot.
Wow.
The medical expenses were crazy. And we ended up losing our home. So I ended up filing for bankruptcy in 2011 and said, okay, either we make a go for it in Sugarloaf where nobody was, no one was buying anything, no one was visiting, or we could pack up everything and go to where his parents were, which was here. We knew Greenport. His family had bought a bed and breakfast here in Greenport in 2003. And we were coming back and forth to visit his parents. During that time they were living here, and we're like, wow, like, look at the difference between where we were, right, with our store in Sugarloaf for a year and Greenport. So we left everything and came here literally with nothing. We came here maybe with a couple of items I still had left from the store. And that's how I ended up here.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, that's...
I don't even know if that went in any sort of like chronological order. But like, again, I tend to talk all over the place.
No, but it's interesting kind of... I didn't really know about some of those places more upstate that way, and some of those more little communities.
Right.
And then it's interesting comparing the market there, like maybe Sugarloaf and then Greenport. Were you thinking of opening up a store here when you initially got here, or?
We specifically came here to open the business, to transfer the business here.
Oh, okay.
So while I was looking for that $300 a month rent thing, I actually thought that I could open up a store in that auditorium once we had that event, because the event was so successful and all the vendors did really well. And I'm like, okay, so what if we sort of made it like a permanent market? And what I ended up calling my business was the White Weathered Barn, because of the building. And I wasn't going to call my business, we were also, that was just my style back then too. I was like the sort of farmhouse, barnwood, rustic, whatever. I wasn't going to call my business the White Weathered Tabernacle. I wasn't going to call it the White Weathered Auditorium. It was just ridiculous. So I called it the White Weathered Barn. And then that's where my idea came. I was like, why don't we convert this into some sort of shoppable market. But because it was private property, not all the residents were keen on people coming back and forth. And then that's how I ended up in Sugarloaf. Subsequently, took the white weathered barn from Sugarloaf and brought it to Greenport. But now it's the weathered barn because my personality and tastes change every 5 years. I get bored. I get tired, and then and at the time in 2000, when I was into that, that's also what they were featuring at Ethan Allen. They were featuring like Swedish country. Everything was white. So my business came out of a time frame when that was like the driving sort of style. And I think just being like in the interior industry and just watching sort of the trends change, I just end up evolving with whatever sort of speaks to me at the time. The other thing that we sort of noticed after opening our business, everything was very like French European and white, Swedish sort of inspired, shabby chic. It's just what was trending at the time. But what we noticed is that it was a very feminine looking store, and we had the bookstore right next door to us. And anytime the men came, they were like, okay, honey, go shopping. I'll be at the bookstore. And I'm like, okay, we're missing out on a whole demographic. So, and Jason was thrilled because he likes things dark. And again, I'm tomboyish. So even though I like pretty things, like where we are now, which is much more rustic, much more unisex, and much more dark, is where I am now. Ask me in 5 years where I'm going to be. I could be in full-blown clown world. Who knows? So we dropped the white out of the name, I think in maybe like 2014, so that it would, and darkened the whole vibe and made it unisex. We had things that both men and women would like, because honestly, there's not really many stores in town that are catered to men. At any rate.
Yeah, I guess more traditionally they haven't. Well, it might have been traditionally more for women, but sometimes
I think it's evolving now too. Like there's certain stores that now carry men and women's clothes. It's not all, tourist women's clothing. I think definitely there's more men's clothing, but there aren't really. I don't think. I mean, I have to. Where there's really like a haberdashery. Do you know what I mean? Like, or I don't know. I can't even think of what kind of business would be kind of cool that men would just absolutely gravitate towards. But at any rate, so that's where we are. We're the weathered barn. And when we moved here, so everything is going to come full circle. I always say, like, at any given point in your life, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And everything from my childhood to now has been this progression of, like, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be right now. My store here, and again, we came here with nothing. And the store started with what I knew how to make. So we were making candles, and I was drawing. I was selling some artwork. I was sewing. So the store consisted of candles that my husband ended up taking over while I sewed and made drawings. And that's all I had, and some furniture pieces. And then in order to have a store that had any inventory, I went back to that idea of bringing in artisans. And instead of them paying towards the rent, I set up like a commission system where I would pay them a commission on their sales. Each month, these artisans would get a check, and I would have a store that was worth going into because there would be more than 3 items in there. So I actually started right by the shipyard. There's a store where Craft Hair is right now. It is a tiny, tiny little boutique, and that was fine because, again, I didn't have a lot of merchandise to work with, but it's not right on the main street. And so I got here in July of 2011. I barely made it through a winter off the beaten path. And in March or April of 2012, I heard a couple talk about visual. I also have like bionic hearing. This has nothing to do with anything. It's just, again, the way my brain is. I heard someone walking from the main intersection of Front Street and Main Street saying, when they got up to my store, they're like, well, we've walked this far. We might as well go in. And I'm thinking, you walked this far from where? Like from Brooklyn? Like you walked 30 yards from the main intersection. I was like, and they came in. It wasn't a store for them. They walked out. And then, this light bulb sort of went off. That was like, wow, this is the mentality that you can't walk 30 yards off the beaten path, off the main drag to explore another store. This is, I guess, the majority of what people are thinking. So I was like, I'm not going to make it. Again, I barely made it by the skin off. Is that the phrase? Skin of your teeth?
Skin off my teeth.
Anyway, whatever that is. I was like, I'm not going to make it. So I was like, let me just take a walk around the village and see if there's anything available. And the store that was available, now this is weird. Although it's not weird because my entire life is like this, where there's these kismet sort of connections. A whole nother show I could tell you how my husband and I met and why we were meant to be. But where the store that I'm in now used to belong to my Aunt Terry's best friend, Jane. And it was the florist, Greenport florist. And she had it for, I think, at least like 20 years. And before we even moved here, when we were coming back to visit Jason's parents, when they had the bed and breakfast, my aunt would always say, please make sure you go in and go say hi to Jane. And anytime I went into Jane's store, and this is before I even had my store here, I'm like, oh my God, what would I do if I ever had a store this size? This is beautiful. And I loved it. And I'm in it now. I mean, it's just weird. So the landlord at the time, the rent was more expensive. It was also at least 3 times the size of what I started with. And it was one of those leaps of faith, which again, I normally do. I don't think about it. I just jump in and I'm like, I can't not take this risk because I will have to close. I just was not going to make it where I was. So it was a handshake. It wasn't even with this landlord. I didn't even have a lease. He's like, don't even worry about the first month's rent. He's like, when you start getting through the summer, he's like, it was great. Some people were like, no, get everything in writing, get all this. And I'm like, I have nothing to lose, or actually rather, I have everything to lose if I don't take this. So we jumped in, we started painting, and I sat on the floor and I started crying and saying, what did I do? I have no idea what I just did. I can't fill this store. I just went into like a spiral of what did I just do kind of thing. But we opened our doors. I had a few sort of sparse things. I ended up meeting different people. I recruited different people, and the store ended up filling with merchandise that I curated from other artists. And I still do the same thing now. And we've been here. We're going into our 14th year.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how has it been even going through COVID and that whole period then?
That was interesting. So I will say that I think part of the reason that my shop is successful is because of Jason and I. We're there. We work there full time. And I think in today's day and age where you can easily buy something online, if you're going to buy something in person, you should at least you need that connection with what you're buying, because why would you let go of your money otherwise? And why wouldn't you just shop online? So Jay and I are there full time, and our customers, we treat them like they're coming into our house, and we're not salespeople at all. Like it's great if you come in and you buy something, but if you just come in and you admire it and walk out with a compliment saying like, oh, this store was lovely, then that's successful in my book. But I don't even know why I started that. What were we talking about?
Oh, just, yeah.
So COVID. Yeah. Yes, COVID. We were fine because we had built up such a relationship with our customers, local and online, that we were making local deliveries to people. I had one customer in particular whose son suffers from, I think he may have grown out of it by now, but he suffered from really bad eczema. And there is so Jason makes all the home fragrance in the store. I make all the bath and body in the store. I make a product that helps with eczema. And during the lockdown, she didn't have access to it. She could have ordered it online, but her son had a massive flare-up. And she emailed me right away and she sent me a picture of it. And she's like, this is my son's hands. And I said, oh my God. I said, I will come over. I was like, I'll put it in a bag. I'll come over, drop it off. And literally, after, she showed me the picture a day later, his hands were fine.
Wow.
So that's the level of service that we provide, whether or not it's during COVID or not. And I think that's sort of something that gave us an edge, because that's the kind of people that Jason and I are, where it was, we didn't care, you know, we'll drive 20 minutes if it meant dropping off something to somebody. So, and we had some government sort of assistance, like whatever programs they were giving out that helped us through. And it really wasn't that long. I think when I look back, when we were in it, it was surreal, but we came out of it, and we went into it with a strong business. We came out of it with a strong business. And the year after COVID, I guess it was 2021, was the best year we've ever had, ever, because everybody moved out here. And then as the city started opening up and people weren't working from home anymore, then we started getting back down to like reality. Regular. Yeah. So we're in that regular mode, which is still great.
Yes.
Yeah. Just
nice.
2021 was out of control, but in a good way. So that's where I am now.
Wonderful. And then to switch a bit, how did you get involved with the Greenport Skate Park?
Yeah. So that is that personality of mine where I don't think about it and I just jump in and I take a risk. Jason and I don't have kids. I don't skate. I was never a skateboarder. Despite being a jock, I was not a skateboarder. And there was Mary Bess Phillips. She's one of our village trustees. Has a page on Facebook called Let's Talk Village of Greenport. It's not an official, village administrative page, but it's a great page. I've been following it for years. And there were photographs on there from, at the time, this boy, his name is Dane Jensen, and his mom, Diana, had posted these photos of the skate park. And it was with this sort of story of my son is devastated. Please look at our park. And it had really bad graffiti. And I'm an advocate for graffiti and artists, but this wasn't it. Like, this wasn't like graffiti. Yeah. This was vulgar words, vulgar depictions, and just there was garbage everywhere. There was the concrete was falling apart. There was holes in the plywood. The park is made out of wood and metal and asphalt and some concrete. At least a third of the park is completely compromised. At any rate, I saw these photos and I was like, this is awful. Like, I just felt so bad for this kid. And I was like, well, how hard can this be? Let's just say, let's fix the park. So I'm like, let's do this. And then, I had no idea what let's do this even meant. But there were a couple of other people who were like, yeah, let's save the park. Those people are no longer with me. They kind of like dropped off.
What year was this that you kind of saw the photos?
2019.
Okay.
So this was before COVID.
And it was just in bad shape.
Yeah, and it still is. So the first thing I thought of was, oh my gosh, I remember when I moved here in 2011, there was this like skate park festival. I had never went to it, but I remember seeing like flyers for it. And with my experience of recruiting artists for that thing that I hosted in Ossining, where I had all those artists in the auditorium, and the artists that I recruited from my store, is like, all right, how hard could it be? I'll just recruit a bunch of people as vendors, and we'll throw this festival. And I had only given myself like 6 months, and then the pandemic hit and got canceled. I was devastated, but like, thank God, because when I look back now on what it really takes to run that festival, I was out of my mind for thinking that I could have, I would have pulled it off, but whatever. I've had years now to plan the one that we have.
Yes.
So that was my first thing, was to have a festival, raise money towards the park. And the more time I spent at the park, the more compromised I realized it was, and that it wasn't going to be like this easy fix. It was going to be a plight of pounding the pavement and raising money. raising money. So that's how I got involved with it.
And could you give a little overview of how the skate park started from the beginning?
So the skate park was created in 1998 under the administration of Mayor Dave Capel. And I believe, so at the time, Mayor Capel is responsible for all of Mitchell Park. He's the one who got the grants and transformed it into the gorgeous waterfront it is now. At the time, before Mitchell Park sort of existed, there was a restaurant called, I think originally it was a restaurant called Mitchell's, and that's why it's called Mitchell Park.
Yes.
But then the restaurant that was there was Kokomo's, and Kokomo's had this great parking lot. And Kokomo's, I guess, closed, and all the skateboarders were skating in the parking lot and making like these do-it-yourself ramps. And I think as Mayor Capel was developing this massive plan for the park, he was like, where are we going to put these skateboarders? And then it was because of him that we have a park at all. And there was some sort of parcel of land that got sold for here and there. I have no idea. And they built a park. And it was the first skate park built on Long Island and the second park built in all of New York State. So the first one that was built is still, it's in Manhattan. It's on Riverside Drive. It's still there. And somewhere in the talks, and it could have been Mayor Capel who knew someone who advocated for that park in the city, and somehow they got together. I don't know the exact history, but there was a skateboarder, Andy Kessler, and he has since passed, but he's the one who designed the one on Riverside Drive, and he's the one who designed our park too. So our park is really significant, again, because it was designed by the late, great Andy Kessler, and because it's the first one on Long Island. And it's also one of the oldest forms of construction. It's not like all the parks that you find now that are built are built in cement because it lasts. Our park was built with wooden frames, 2x4s, plywood, and sheets of metal, and some cement, and on a foundation that's asphalt. And the asphalt is just, it's devastatingly cracked. I mean, it's just, it's
not a smooth
it's
ride.
Not smooth, but it's not a smooth ride by a long shot anyway, because it's asphalt, right?
Yeah.
But there's massive fissures in it with weeds, coming out of it. There's one section of the cement, a whole third, where the cement is completely sloughed off the face of one of the ramps. And then all the ones that are made out of wood, all that plywood over the fact that it's still standing is actually a testament to how it was built. Because I think we just celebrated our 25th year. But all the plywood underneath is rotted. The metal was rusted. The screws that were holding the metal sheets down weren't galvanized, so they were rusted and they were falling out. So it's in bad shape. And what we have done since 2019, although we've really gained more momentum after the pandemic, was replacing each board of plywood that was rotted, replacing all the screws to galvanize. So it's piecemeal, but it was one of those things where we were just trying to preserve what existed, but our ultimate goal is to have it raised to the ground and rebuilt in cement so that we don't go through the issue that we're going through now. One of the biggest issues is that when the park was built, which again, it was a beautiful thing, there was and since Mayor Capel's administration ended, there was never this maintenance plan put in place so it was just like, let's solve an issue, let's build, Mitchell Park, make it beautiful, let's secure a safe place for these kids to skate, but no plan. Nothing the budget from the administration is $500 a year. What does that do? It does nothing. I think that maybe helps the weed whacker. Like, it doesn't really do anything structurally for the park. So it's just fallen into a complete state of disrepair. It's disheartened a lot of kids who grew up at that park. And a lot of these kids who grew up at that park don't know the park any different than what it is. They've always been skating on something really crappy. So it's time to to put Greenport on the map for something other than, bars, restaurants. And I got heavily invested in the community. And that's our whole, we started a nonprofit. I think we got our nonprofit status in 2022. And our whole mission, it's not just to rebuild the skate park, but to build and grow the community. And my feeling and my heart is in this specifically for the community, because I think they are often forgotten about in lieu of, all these tourist attractions. Like the park isn't even in the center of the village, so it's not even getting like tourist attraction.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my big thing, that these kids deserve better, and they shouldn't be felt to be made to feel that they've been forgotten. And skateboarding is an amazing sport. It's still considered a very cool sport. It's in the Olympics, for goodness sakes. Do you know what I mean? So
yes.
So yeah.
And you mentioned some of the design features and being very unique, even for just having an early skate park like that. But obviously you want to renovate it and have it for long-term maintenance.
Right.
But is that something that you have a design plan?
Yes.
Is it for half of the park?
Right. So
now?
in January, we hired a skate park designer, Doug Ketterman. He is from Portland, Oregon. And we went with him because his website showed these amazing 3D virtual fly-throughs of designs that he did, urban designs, skate park designs. He doesn't just do skate parks, but it was his visuals that sealed the deal for us. So we have a design for the entire park, which revolves around... So one of the things that makes our park really, really unique are those metal ramps. One is a 12-foot half pipe. There are no parks on Long Island that have anything like that at all. Nothing even close. I think the closest you could go for something like that is to Woodward, which is a skateboarding camp in Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
So it may be a little archaic in terms of, I think what the skateboarding trend now is more like street course skating. Not many people skate that vert ramp, but it's something that we realize puts us in a unique position because no one else has it. And it is something that, as scary as it is, because it's big, it's something that people can achieve, as they get better at skating. They could be like, oh, wow, I can actually now, test that out. So we don't want to get rid of that. And it's also connected to two other ramps that are like 6 and 8 feet tall. Those are the ones that are the rotted wood and metal, but are so beloved and so unique that we will not get rid of them because the community loves it so much. So we are building everything around those metal frames, and it'll just be a nice sort of paying an homage to Andy Kessler, right? To have something still there that he designed and something unique to us. And everything else will be concrete. And not only is it longer lasting, there's foundations like the Tony Hawk Foundation, for instance. They only give grants if you're using cement because it doesn't make a smart investment if you're not. So that's where the design is. But money-wise, the entire park, renovating it, I think, is like $1.8 million. And the part that is completely compromised right now, that it's barely even skatable, is the part that we want to attack first. And that doesn't even include around those metal big ramps that we have. And that's $1 million by itself. So that's phase one. It will be all cement and much more modern with more skating features for kids who are starting at like 2 years old and they're on a skateboard. Right now, it's so compromised that, I mean, I wouldn't want my kid skating on that. I wouldn't want my kid learning on that. And there's just a lot of the fixtures too have been removed because they've just crumbled. So it used to be where, there was like a course that you could kind of skate around that made sense. And now it's like a lot of those fixtures are removed. Half of them are crumbling. So it's like you're forced to only really skate where those ramps are. And again, one of them is 12 feet high. So now you're really limited because not many people skate that big ramp. So it's just a small portion of the park actually that's even used. So So we'll start with phase 1 once we raise $1 million.
And have you been working with other organizations or businesses, whether it's through the village or
Right.
I don't know if the town of Southold?
Once I believe the town of Southold has supported the park years ago. And then again, that we've had some past administrations, and I understand it's like the skate park isn't a huge attraction. There's roads that need to be fixed, for the benefit of all of Greenport. This is a very small niche. So it just didn't, I don't blame any administration for not paying attention to it, but now it's a village asset that's not even an asset. So let's make it an asset. And now with the new administration, Kevin Stussy has been supportive of us since day one. And he comes from a development background. His 2 daughters skate. So I think he's going to be instrumental in helping us reach across the aisle, so to speak, re-engage Southold Town, get them a part of our fundraising process. So one of my board members and I just went to the work session in April and presented on their screen that sort of 3D fly-through of what the park can look like. So that was our official presentation to the village, which now gets entered into the record. Yes. And now that it's entered into the record, we can officially apply for grants through the village. So that's one avenue, right, with the village helping us. Us working on our own outside of the village is sort of soliciting donations and grants from local foundations. We got a wonderful grant from North Fork Side by Side, who helped fund the mini railroad. The 2 women I was in touch with, them fell in love with the story and I guess my passion for the kids in our community and wanted to fund that. And then we got an amazing a large private donation from an anonymous source who very much cares about the community. So we've just now hit our first milestone, which is $100,000. And I think now that we have the visual plan, now that we've presented it to the village and everything is now officially on the books, and now that we've raised $100,000, it makes it more tangible. Like, we weren't just a bunch of people being like, hey, which is how I started. Hey, let's fix the park. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah. Now it's real and now it has some legs. And so now I can just, it will propel forward. I'm sure there's grants available through New York State recreation departments, capital improvement type things that we can apply for. So, but I still have stamina for this project. It's very difficult because, again, it's not centralized in the village. There's still a negative sort of stereotype attached to kids who skate. Like they're all a bunch of druggies, just hanging out. But it's not. I mean, it's a serious, extreme sport, recognized, as I mentioned, by the Olympics. And the importance of having a facility like that is to get kids off the drugs. Do you know what I mean? Give them a space that's safe where they have an outlet to sort of release whatever tension they've got, whatever anxiety there's a lot out there with these kids these ages. Yes. Between like say 15 and 25, it's different than it was in the 80s when I was growing up. There's so much more stimulus now. And I don't know how these kids are navigating through society right now, but at least now there's a place where they can go to release all that frustration, make some friends, be social, get outside, get off your phone, and get some exercise in the process. So,
could you say or talk about how it has impacted some of the lives of some skaters, or if there's any stories that you could tell or say?
Well, one of our avid skaters, Justin Thatcher, grew up at the park. He's known as Bo. I don't know how he got that nickname. I should probably ask him. But he ended up going pro. He moved to Colorado. He was teaching skating out there. And then, and I think he traveled to a couple of other different places. One of his sisters lives in Santa Fe, so I think he was out in the West for a while, and he actually just came back 2 years ago. It's really good to see him come back to his roots. And I think there was a lot of people his age that grew up at the park that have gone through this just being a phase of being discouraged and feeling like, well, nothing's ever going to happen because anybody who said they were going to do something about it hasn't. So I think it actually took a little while for some of them to understand that I have nothing to gain from this. Like it's, if anything, it takes my time away from my own business. Mm-hmm. But I'm passionate about it. And I just jumped in. I don't even really know why I did. I just felt compelled to. But there aren't any like real stories other than the potential of stories, right? So if we get the park to where it needs to be, there can be more people like Bo, right, who could turn pro or could have an avenue where they're teaching lessons or they open up their own skate shop. Or what we want to sort of encourage once we get the park constructed in a safe manner is to show these kids avenues where they can have careers in this sport that aren't necessarily being a pro skater. You know, you could be a sports photographer, you could be a videographer, you could have a camp, you could have educational programs, which I personally will not be responsible for, but I'm hoping that this generation who sees this community coming together with a state-of-the-art park can see the potential of what kind of angle that they can have in their life that turns into a career. Because a lot of these kids, they're not college kids, you know, they can be entrepreneurs. They could come out with their own merchandise, their own fashion line revolved around skating. There's so many avenues, and they might not know what they are. So we're there to hopefully mentor them and help them keep skateboarding in their life because it's their passion. So that's where we hope to create the stories, is that once we get the park a place where it's safe to skate, that it will grow into a more of a commercial sort of entity, which also we hope has an impact on the downtown village, where we can bridge the park to the business district where they're not two separate things. So one of your questions was if I'm working with any other entities. I just came up with like a campaign that's going to be presented to the business district, where it's a merchant collaboration, where there's a brochure, and the brochure costs $25. And in that brochure to a customer, there's going to be a list of hopefully 40 businesses that will give a $5 discount if you spend $50. So what this does is bring awareness to that customer for why they're spending $25. That $25 will go towards the park's renovation. And all they have to do is shop at 5 of the businesses and it pays for itself. So that's our newest sort of way of bridging the business community with the skate park community as a way. I mean, Greenport's pretty special like that. I didn't grow up with like community. Again, all the history that I explained earlier on was just my schooling, and that's where my friends were. I maybe had like 1 or 2 neighbors that I was friends with, but there was no, and Mount Vernon's a city, so it wasn't like a small little village of friends and family and that kind of thing like it is here. So this is, Greenport is pretty special in that regard. So, yeah.
And do you have any other annual events that you do every year? Because I saw it was a Skate and Sound.
The Sound and Skate Festival?
And Skate Festival.
So the first one that we had was in 2022, and I kind of wanted to blow it out of the park. So, and I also knew that there were going to be expenses involved in running a festival like that. So I tried to get as many vendors as I could to offset those costs. And in the end, even though the event was like spectacular, I mean, it was so great. It was the first event, like I think I mentioned, they had festivals there for like 8 consecutive years, but they were small. It was a little bit of skating. They had a skate contest. They had like a band or two and some hot dogs, hamburgers, that kind of thing. It wasn't like a vendor setup. There wasn't a gigantic stage with 6 live, performances. So although that event was like successful and raised like some awareness, we are not going to do it that size again. The one that we had planned for last year, so the first one that we had in 2022, it was like 98 degrees out there, and it was insufferable. And we didn't get a lot of traffic towards, nobody wanted to be outside in 98 degrees. No vendors wanted to be outside. So it was very difficult on the vendors. And again, I had like 100 vendors. And for your first year, if you don't have a built up, nobody knew it was our first year. So no one even really knew about it. We didn't have a big following. We hadn't built up like the hype of like this great event because it was the first one we ever had. So anyway, it ended up being not so great for the vendors because they were just spread too thin and there just wasn't enough traffic there. And again, because I think because it was just too hot, we didn't get a lot of traffic. So the following year, which was last year, we're like, let's not have it in 90-degree weather. Let's do it in October. That's a beautiful month. And we were all set for it. And then September through October, every weekend we had a rainstorm and it got rained out. So we are now moving it back to summer, and it's July 13th of this year. We've scaled it to maybe like between 40 and 50 vendors. We have about 6 live music performers. We have 24 artists from Long Island, New York City, and New Jersey that come and paint canvases. Part of what we do at these events is try to celebrate what all of skate culture, it's not just skateboarding, it's fashion, music, and art. So any events that we've ever had have sort of like had those themes. So the festival is like our big event. We've had like smaller events, like smaller fundraisers, what we call sort of like pop-up events. We've had like fashion shows and skate expos at the GDC roller rink with Mindy Ryan, who's been like a great partner with us. We had summer concerts last year in the park. But this year, we found that we got more traction raising money with seeking out foundations whose mission sort of aligned with ours, and less focus on the pop-up events, which, quite frankly, suck the life out of me and don't really have that much of a return. So our fundraising aspects have not been, we've changed our strategy to fundraise not through events. The festival was never really a fundraiser as much as it was like a celebration. So so any events that we have are typically now going to just be celebratory events where the community comes together and engages and understands that we are working towards something better. And our fundraising events are going to be, we're not really going to do fundraising events as much as we're going to this year, going to just try to solicit grants.
Okay.
Yeah, we've had more success in raising money that way.
And it's kind of hard to put a time frame on. You have like the first phase, but there's not. You've reached that first milestone, but you can't really.
It took me 2 years.
Yes.
To raise $100,000, and the thing, I look at, say, like the movie theater, for instance, and they were able to raise $1 million in, I don't know, maybe like 2-3 months. And I look at our park and I think about our kids and I'm like, why? Like, why is it so difficult to get people to care about a skate park? And I understand the theater is phenomenal. First of all, I'm a huge advocate for it. I donated towards it. I think it's going to be an amazing attraction to our business district. But that's the business district again, right? Like, where are the people who care about the community?
And more the recreational area.
And why isn't that important? Like, don't you see these kids like holed up in their rooms on their phones? They have play dates where like one kid is sitting on the couch, the other one's sitting in a chair, and they're not even talking to each other. They're just on their phones. Like, why wouldn't you want to bring about some kind of positive change for our youth and get them outside and get them socializing? Especially coming out of COVID, those kids with their masks on and not being in school was like, who knows what kind of impact that really had on them. So why aren't people wanting to invest in this? I don't get it. And the only thing I can think of is that there is some sort of negative stereotype still attached to skate parks. And it's like, that's the point of doing everything that we're doing, is that it's not this negative stereotype. We're trying to get people educated as to why recreation is so important to these kids. So I feel like I've been banging my head against the wall for a lot. And then you get, North Fork Side by Side coming in and saying, we absolutely agree with your mission. It means, we understand your passion. And you get that private donor who's like, oh my gosh, of course this is important. But we need more of those. And so as far as like a timeline, it took 2 years to raise $100,000. But we also didn't have the plans then, right? So because now we got enough money where we're able to spend money on professional plans, I think that will sort of allow the fundraising to happen quicker because people see that it's a real thing now. It's not just an idea.
Yes. And how can people get involved or help out? And even just in terms of where they might be able to donate.
So there's a couple of things that people can do right now besides that business merchant sort of collaboration that we're working towards. We are also working towards having an online auction of high ticket items or experiences. So we're reaching out to businesses that might offer like a wine tour and that has a certain value to it that we can auction off. We had a lot of success last year with one of our board members had 2 Knicks tickets, and we did an online auction and we raised almost $3,000 just from that. So we're going to be putting that out, soliciting sort of higher sought after high ticket items to auction off. The other thing that people can do is really spread the word. And again, a lot of the money that we've received, we've gotten through private foundations, whether it be, I mean, I have one private foundation who's donated to us like 3 times over the years. And there's estates out there, and someone is the executor of the estate, and every year they get a certain amount that they are able to give to a charity. And we're just hoping that there's more people who will understand what our mission is and hope that they will contribute to our fundraising campaign. And I don't really know if there's a database to find out where all those foundations are. So that's one thing we've kind of put out there on social media a lot. I'm like, if you know of a foundation whose mission aligns with ours, and they can consider donating money to us, to just let me know, because we're just not, we're all volunteers. We all run our own, but besides myself, I have 5 other board members. We're all business owners. So it's the other thing where people can help is to jump on to our board or committees and help us, because the amount of work that it is to run the website, run social media, do our newsletters, do fundraising, write grants, come up with ideas. It's so much work, and we do it in our spare time. And there's only 6 of us, and we need more people to physically help us. We need more people to spread the word. We need more people to attend our events. We just need to bring more people together who understand why it's important.
And I think just 2 other questions. Just in general, since moving here and living out here and having your business and being involved in the community, what have you enjoyed most about living and working on the North Fork?
So we moved here specifically to move our business. We didn't move here because we were like, this is a beautiful area to enjoy. It was all based on work. It's just an extra bonus that it happens to be a stunning landscape, stunning area. But what I've learned, or what I've come to appreciate over the years, is the community aspect. I again, just with the skate park, I've just dove headfirst into that. And that's the area that I find most special about the whole North Fork. To be honest, the North Fork in general is like one larger community, and Greenport is like this centralized community. I have relationships with other business owners all across the North Fork, so it's pretty tight knit. But as far as, so for Jay and I, because it's about work, we don't really get to enjoy the North Fork like people who come here specifically to visit, or to 1 or 2 days we'll be like, oh, let's play tourist. But our tourist days are on days where we're off and everyone else is closed. So we feel the landscape around us as this beautiful entity that's very, very peaceful. But to be honest, we don't get to enjoy it like
with the amount of work and running a business.
Yeah, and now being a president of a nonprofit, I'm just going to keep spreading myself thinner. So yeah, but we also know that we're blessed to live here. So I wish we could enjoy it a little bit more leisurely, but
And just looking to the future, obviously you would like to see the completion of the skate park renovations, but just as a whole, what do you hope for the future of the North Fork and its community down the line?
I hope that the community doesn't get lost. We've seen the change, people who bought their houses here like in the 70s, or the 90s, and you see like, oh my gosh, Greenport's changed. Where I grew up doesn't look anything like it did, Everything is going to evolve. What I hope is that it does not evolve to the point where, and we're kind of almost there, to be honest, where it's just about tourism. If you understand the community and are aware of it, you realize how special it is. I just don't want it getting stomped out in lieu of more tourism. So there used to be more mom and pop shops. There used to be restaurants that were owned by a family, which are now owned by these financial groups. And so we've seen just in the last 5 years that the so-and-so historical, the Soundview, for instance, used to be owned by, whomever it was owned by, wasn't a big financial group that owns it. Silver Sands was a family that owned it. It was this retro modern thing, and they've transformed it into this amazing destination. It's gorgeous, and I can appreciate all of that. Yes. But it's not one owner. It's a group now. Claudio's is a group.
And then it's obviously with the market and everything, it's harder for a single small family to even buy a property like that. So we're seeing more of these bigger.
Well, that's the other. So, I will be honest. There's so many conversations about affordable housing. I don't think that's going to happen. There's nowhere to build in Greenport. You can build up, but then you're going to change the character of the village itself. Jason and I don't even own here. We've been renting in our friend's home. They live in San Francisco. We've been renting since we moved here 2011, and we ended up buying property, but in Pennsylvania, because that's the only thing that we could afford. So, and the only reason we can afford to live here is because, thank God, the business, affords us our rent. But the rents are astronomical, and we're lucky because they're our friends, so they're not jacking the rent up to something outrageous, and they could easily. They don't. The rents are not affordable. The houses are not affordable. The other thing that happens to the downtown is that as these buildings go for sale, it's no longer, that building sold for $500,000. Oh, that building just sold for 2-point-something million. Okay, so now the owner is going to rent that to who? A mom and pop shop? They can't afford $5,000 a month rent. You're going to have to rent it to a commercial, chain. And now you will literally change that landscape. And it's happening. I'm 55. I don't think I'll be retired at 65, but I hope that I still get to enjoy the community as much as I can while I'm still here. But I think it's one of those things that it's going to happen. It's been progressively happening. I don't think it's going to stop.
It's hard to slow down that. It's a wave. Too much success that you can't slow down the amount of money that's coming out here and how to keep that so we don't lose diversity within the business world and within different socioeconomic groups and people. So that's
what makes a community interesting, right? Is people from different backgrounds. I will say the one thing specifically about Greenport and the North Fork in general is that, and I always refer to Little Creek Oysters, the oyster shack, right? Which is this massive destination. And it's just this tiny little shack, and it's all about community. It's all about the people who go there, and you could be a Wall Streeter or you could be a dock builder. No one cares how much money you have. You're sitting elbow to elbow with someone shucking oysters, right? And that's what life is in Greenport. That's what it should be. And I hope things like that continue to stay, but you're going to, what's the gentrification term, right? Where you start losing that diversity and losing the mix of classes, because it just is overwrought with, high-end everything.
Yes.
So I'd love to say that I'm hopeful that it won't change to that, but I think it will. I mean, we've been watching it, so.
Yes.
So yeah.
No, I think and then was there anything else you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't talked about?
No, I think that, again, I talk in circles. I don't know. Once you go to edit this, I don't even know if any of it is going to make any sense whatsoever. Other than the only thing I guess I could probably hope for, besides when you were asking me how people can get involved, I wish that more businesses took the time to invest in this asset within the community than letting 1 to 6 people take care of the entire park. I think there are some who feel that the administration, it was the administration's responsibility to take care of this, and they didn't. And there may be some kind of animosity there, like, well, why do we have to pick up the pieces? Well, why not? Do you know what I mean? Because the kids are still the kids, whether or not it's anyone's fault. Do you know what I mean? That the park looks the way it does. Who cares? There's still kids being raised here, and there still needs to be a place to go. So please get over it. Get over any animosity that you might have. Get over any negative stereotypes the park has, and just be a part of your community, not just for your own business. Please get involved in, and they do. I'm not going to say that businesses don't. They may have their own charities that they do, but that's what I'm hoping with the sort of the merchant collaboration, is that more merchants get involved in helping. Subsequently, it's almost like an afterthought that it helps the park. In general, the brochure is a way to drive customers into their businesses. So hopefully that they'll be inspired to help for that. But I hope that they're inspired to help those of us who are volunteering all our time on behalf of the community. I wish we just had more people.
Absolutely.
Who cared?
Yes, definitely. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come in today and sharing
honestly, I don't know how you're going to edit this, because I'm all over the place.
No, it was good. I want to thank you for sharing your story and how you came out here and your wonderful business out here, as well as your continued involvement and passion in the community, especially with the skate park.
Yeah.
So it was really nice talking with you.
It was great. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 61 with Rena Wilhelm. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.